This is Restless. Here we are this restless summer. We are here continuing the post-mortem on the young, restless, and reformed. And this summer, we are continuing to do a number of interviews where we're actually trying to look ahead. We're not trying to only think about what has come in the past, but what might hold for the church in the future and what was the YRR. So I am here joined, as always, by Pastor Michael. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. This is Restless Summer, and so we have to be in good spirits all the time. And so I am in good spirits and excited to have back on the show with us Aaron Renn. Aaron, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Do you want to maybe just share a little bit about yourself? We didn't grab a bio to read for you, but do you want to share a little bit of a bio so that folks who might not know kind of who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am the co-founder and a senior fellow at American Reformer, which is a nonprofit organization focused on reinvigorating Protestant Christianity in America's religious, political, and cultural life. You can find all of my writings personally at aaronrenn.com. So I'm a writer on essentially Christianity and culture as well as men's issues. I also had a previous career as in public policy, writing about cities and researching urban policy. Was with the Manhattan Institute for a long time, and I still do some of that today. And then prior to that, I was a management consultant for a long time. So that's kind of the professional hat that I bring to bear.
That's great. We are glad to have you and here to talk about a number of the subjects, and we'll just see where the conversation goes. I think everyone would enjoy the Aaron Renn show, the podcast. It's a great show, and so I think you'll find, Aaron, you talk about a really wide variety of topics there. What have you been talking about recently on your podcast?
Well, I did one earlier today with some reflections on the reversal of Roe versus Wade. And again, I tend to look at things through kind of institutional and cultural lenses more than a lot of theological reflections on it. So I talk a little bit about that. Another one that I talked about was the quest for legacy, how we all, despite living in a world in which sort of individual autonomy and sort of creating your own identity is the norm, we nevertheless long to have a sense of identity that we've inherited. We want to have inherited something and also to have a legacy to pass on to the future. Things of that nature. That's a lot of the kinds of things that I would talk about in the podcast as well.
Yeah, I think I look forward to your reflection on Roe v. Wade, and maybe either right at the end of this, if we have time, I may ask you a question in regards to the overturning of Roe and the we'll call it at least the evangelical cooperation with the conservative movement along the way. But for now, I do think the frame that you bring to these things, and actually, I know it was one of your interests in the YRR, is this cultural and institutional frame, right? With the work of Brad Vermeulen, how he tracked how the YRR kind of gathered these positions of power for, what they viewed as obviously good purposes. But tell us about why thinking in terms of institutions is so important.
Well, institutions wield a lot of power. So you can think about, for example, universities. If you want to get a good job in society today, you practically have to have a college degree. It is a credential that you must possess for the average person. Now, perhaps we need to change that, but the reality is that's what it is today. And not all colleges are created equal. Ivy League institutions, particularly Harvard, Princeton, Yale, are much more influential in terms of opening doors to you and giving you access to elite networks and positions. One thing that I saw when I was in New York and in DC in the policy world is, having degrees from these institutions is like a credential that makes you be taken seriously in certain parts of the country. And so that's that's an important part of it. It's just one example of an institution. The Supreme Court is an institution that wields enormous power. You could think about, the accrediting bodies for universities. So yes, the universities are institutions that you need to, pay your toll to get your credentials so you can work. But what do the universities teach and how do they operate? A lot of that is determined by parameters set by the accrediting agencies that determine whether or not your degree actually counts for anything. So there are all these institutions that are interlinked, interconnected, and they wield a lot of power in the world. And, as a result, we have to care about institutions. And ultimately, if you want to accomplish anything, it takes more than, one or two people typically to do it. And so if you want to mobilize more than a handful of people to accomplish anything in the world, institutions are the main way that we do that today. And institutions are the main way that we can perpetuate things after we're gone.
That's great. Now, let's add to that the question, what you can speak of conservatives, but even conservative Christians, in your experience and opinion, do they think this way or act in accords with kind of how you're describing the importance of these things?
Christians have been great institution builders. I mean, the Christian church is the oldest institution in the world. There are actual individual churches that go back to the time of the New Testament. Somebody made a comment on Twitter to the effect of, no, all the churches that Paul planted are gone today. Some quip about that. And basically their idea was, it doesn't really matter if Christianity goes extinct in Europe because it'll spread around the world, et cetera. And of course, someone replied with it, that's interesting. Here's the current bishop of Philippi. Here's the current bishop of Thessaloniki. I don't remember all of them, but I just went through all these churches and here's the bishops of these churches that are still around. And so, the church is an institution. And even in the evangelical world, I mean, evangelicals do nothing but create institutions. Create new churches, new parachurch organizations, new movements, new nonprofits. Think about American Reformer. It's an institution,
right?
That I helped co-found. So I would say evangelicals tend to be very interested in institutions. They tend to be less sanguine about which institutions are critical in terms of power and cultural influence in America. And they also tend to be very quick to abandon existing institutions when they feel that those institutions are drifting left or going woke or whatever. They often have a hair trigger, I've observed, to leave institutions and start new ones, which is a weakness in an important sense. But they definitely believe in institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this seems so. I'm coming right off of having been in Birmingham, Alabama, all last week for the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in America, and so while there and just engaged in a lot of the discussions and the assembly in general, one of the things that's on my mind often is the kind of trajectory that is often true of denominations, and one of the things that seems clear to me within the Presbyterian Church in America right now is that there are concerns about the direction of the denomination in some quarters, and there are many churches and men who seem to be so quick to say, we have to leave, we have to get out of here, we have to start something new. Why is it that conservatives, particularly, it seems to me anyway, maybe I'm wrong and you can tell me, why is it that conservative Christians seem to be quick to kind of, take their ball and go home?
Very good question. I don't know all the answers to that, but I do think it's notable that liberals have a very good track record of taking over institutions.
Right.
And so being afraid that a denomination or another organization is on a trajectory that we've seen many times before, certainly is not entirely unwarranted. Now, the PCA itself was a product of people who split away from the Southern Presbyterian Church in the 70s. Therefore, the people who populate it already have a mentality of splitting.
Yes.
So once you've split once, it's much easier to split the second time, which is why second marriages have a higher divorce rate than first marriages, and so on. Now, what I would say about the PCA and kind of contradistinction to the mainline Presbyterian churches is there may have been very good reasons to leave, the mainline when they did, because the mainline Presbyterian denominations, like many of the mainline denominations, the denomination controls the property.
Yep. And
if you have an opportunity to leave and you don't take it, you may find yourself marooned in a very bad place. Whereas the PCA, and I believe all of these split off denominations, the local congregation clearly owns the property and controls what their own future. Therefore, there's less need to leave while the getting's good, so to speak. But I do think, pure kind of people who are concerned about doctrinal purity or confessionalism or things of that nature tend to have this idea that we're going to leave. And of course, once you leave, that actually weakens the organization and makes it easier for other elements to kind of take it over, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that, those who have left maybe in the, recent history. I mean, we still have men within the PCA today who were a part of the, initial group that left in 1973 and founded the PCA. But, just within the last few years, as I've become more engaged kind of in these, these denominational politics, in a sense, one of the things that happened over the last few years is there was a group of a handful of men in churches, some with pretty loud voices within the PCA, who left to start their own denomination. And that's already split again. And so, I mean, it does seem like that is really, really common.
That's what happened with the original OPC. When they kicked Gresham Machen out of the Northern Presbyterian Church, he created the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which very rapidly split into the OPC and then the Bible Presbyterian Church. Yeah. So this is not unusual to see these splits. The people who leave to start their own thing. Again, there's probably a personality aspect to it as well. It's people who, maybe have trouble operating in a bigger tent environment, et cetera. And I don't denigrate that, because I think it takes all types. We need firebrands. We need sort of some company men. We need a mix of people in the right proportions in order to make things work, just as the body of Christ needs people with different gifts. We don't need everybody to have the same gift. We don't have everybody to have the same personality.
Yeah.
So could be that the personalities are less amenable to being part of some of these organizations. It's a possibility.
I think that is one really important thing. And it is, whatever your personality type is, I think there's that natural desire. You just hate working with those other, right? The firebrands hate the company men, right? Let's hold it together. But on some level, right, those are all important. And it makes me wonder if actually in the conservative institutional playbook, there's actually a level of institutional knowledge that, hey, when this goes bad, we start again. Like that because it's such a track record, if that is, the PCA is set up in a way so it's actually very easy for you to leave, right? There's an institutional thing was learned from the Southern Presbyterian Church, which is we've got to make sure they can't come for our property, all of these things this time. And obviously there's a good reason for that because of what happened, and is what continues to happen as people try and leave the mainline church. But it seems to not give, it does not incentivize staying in an institution, right? Or like staying in the PCA, or these kinds of things like this.
Right, exactly.
I think maybe just really, maybe you can't do it briefly. I think you gave a great you told the story of how the Lutheran Missouri Synod actually is an example of the conservatives theologically and culturally kind of retaking an institution. Can you just, I don't know, tell a little bit about why that's an important example, or kind of what went on with that?
Yes, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is one of the main Lutheran bodies in the United States. Traces its origins back to Germany. Unlike in the Presbyterian world, the different Lutheran denominations are by and large not a product of splits. Lutheranism was hyper fragmented, and actually it sort of congealed, over time into these various groupings. The LCMS is one, and I believe it was back in the 1970s. Their seminaries were starting to adopt these historical critical methods of, Bible interpretation. There was kind of liberalization afoot, as happened in, every denomination at that time. And a group of people, I believe the main guy behind it was a guy named Jacob Preuss, and his family is apparently still very active in the LCMS, sort of made it his mission to rectify the situation. And so it started with a seminary. The flagship seminary was Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. He became the president of it, and was starting to root out these things he didn't like. And basically, the liberals staged a walkout, and he essentially fired them all at the end of the day. I mean, it was like 95% of the faculty and most of the students left. And called themselves the Concordia Seminary in Exile, or Seminex. And I think they thought that they were going to be able to take back over, but it didn't work out that way. And then ultimately, a few liberal congregations did leave and joined with what's now the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And so there was essentially a move in a conservative direction there. I don't pretend to have all the details on that. I would encourage you to read the Wikipedia page on Seminex, which would give you a little bit of the history there. But that was an example of something that came back. And, a lot of it has to do with the particular peculiarities of church governance and how the rules of these denominations work. So there was a rule in the LCMS that you could not be ordained as a minister in the denomination, and you couldn't be hired as a minister of a church unless you had graduated from a denominational seminary. That is not the case in Presbyterianism. And so in the LCMS case, if you cleaned house in the seminaries and controlled the seminaries, then you cut off the oxygen supply. You cut off the flow, And so there were a lot of interesting little nuances there. But apparently the people who pulled that off were quite knowledgeable of the rule book and were willing to fight a lot of bureaucratic trench warfare in a way that conservatives have tended not to. And I believe the LCMS situation was one of the inspirations for the Southern Baptist conservative resurgence, which was another example of a sort of a reversal of a more liberal denomination that had been trending in a more liberal direction.
Right. And both, are more of a credit to these, I don't know what these kind of they're more a credit to a bureaucratic mastermind than a theological genius, right, in these modern settings.
Right. I think with the conservative resurgence, the conservatives figured out that the majority of the people were conservative, and that under the SBC, Constitution, if they could win the presidency of the SBC for 10 consecutive years, they could take the whole thing over, because the president appoints all the members of this committee. So it's through the various appointments to the various committees that would propagate over time, if you were able to maintain the presidency for a decade or so, you could turn over all the entity heads and trustees and all of that, and essentially then you've controlled the denomination. And of course, the Baptist world itself is radically different from Presbyterianism because this local church autonomy is fundamental to the Baptist system. It's congregationalist, basically.
Right.
And so that Southern Baptist Convention is not really a denomination per se. It's more of a cooperative organization there where Baptists come together to fund missions and seminaries and things of that nature. So a little bit of a different scenario there.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, as we talk through these things, it seems often that we talk about maybe the typical trend seems to be you have this founding. This is within the church anyway. I don't know if you would say this is true, more generally speaking, but at least within the church, within denominational structures, it seems like you have very often this founding that is maybe more what we would term conservative, and then over time you have a takeover of some kind that is by those who are more liberal or progressive in their outlook on things. Am I right to think that those who are progressive and liberal are better at taking over institutions, but not as good at building them themselves? Is that a legitimate thing to think? It just seems like that is a common theme. I don't see as much of the building of institutions from the more progressive end. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's broadly accurate. What I would say that people on the left are very good at building political institutions, but not so much at building functional institutions. In a sense, it's sort of like they don't have as many kids, but they're very good at taking your kids over to their way of thinking. And I don't even, one of the reasons that this happens, Gary North wrote a book about the liberalization of the Northern Presbyterian Church during the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And one of his takeaways was there's sort of kind of two priorities you can have. One is doctrinal purity, and the other is missionalism. And the missionalism or the church growth mindset always wins, because if your mindset is growth, then you will eventually get the numbers and the numbers will enable you to take over. And so when you think about churches in America, you're trying to get people in the door, you're trying to carry out the Great Commission. What are you going to do? You're going to make as low a bar for entry as you can possibly justify. And if you don't personally do that, someone else will. So they're going to be people who are always going to say, we need to have a low bar to entry. We got, let's not put any barriers between people in the gospel. Let's not worry about all these doctrinal points or all this liturgy or all this. And those people eventually attract a lot of adherents, and then they numerically overwhelm the organization. So you're almost, the people who focus on a higher bar, more of a purity. So his conundrum is you can either have a small, pure denomination or essentially a large and drifting organization. At the end of the day, but it's hard to have a large kind of pure organization.
Right. Yeah, that is tough. I think the other thing, and you've talked a little bit about this, is there is this concern of, there's an emphasis on church planting, which is a good emphasis. Just so all the listeners know, I am soon going to be part of planting a PCA church in an area where there are no Reformed churches. But I think that as I've kind of entered this world more fully, I'm now hearing from lots of people involved in all of these kinds of things. It strikes me as that oftentimes this emphasis on church planting doesn't come from the question isn't asked, how do we start a congregation that will be here in 100 years, right? As many of these, especially the larger cities, have these congregations that have been there that long, right? They seem to be very much I don't know what the right word to describe it is. The goal is quick growth, right? Maybe that's what maybe it's these two. I don't know if it's on this spectrum, but right, it's this, we want to achieve quick growth rather than institutional longevity. Is that kind of your, does that fall in line a little bit of your concern about how church planting kind of has caught on in the evangelical world and talking about it in the last 20 years?
You're right that these churches start, and there are some, of course, there's a high failure rate for church startups, but the ones that succeed in part because they're very tuned to the moment.
Yep. The
moment's always changing. And then pretty soon you are now the old congregation that's not very good anymore and go into the decline. A lot of these churches succeed because they're sort of a charismatic founding pastor, particularly the mega churches. Right. When that pastor retires or moves on, what happens. So there are some issues around longevity. I think the other thing that happens with these churches is that they essentially parasitize existing churches and weaken them, weaken them. And I would ask that question, like, where are the people who are attending your church going to come from? And in my observation, especially in urban settings, a lot of them are coming from existing churches. So we're circulating a lot of people through there. And so if you go back to, say, 1989, when Tim Keller started Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York, he was like the only evangelical church there. And so there were a lot of new converts. He made a lot of new converts. I think that's probably much less the case that a church in Manhattan today is making a lot of new converts. I think it would also be very interesting to go back at that era and ask how many people attending mainline churches in New York switched over to Redeemer when it became available, because there was like a better option, sure, if you will. It's just this Roe versus Wade thing. The PCUSA's policy office in Washington issued a tweet talking about, lamenting and bemoaning the fact that Roe versus Wade was overturned and saying, well, this is horrible. We had to support a women's right to choose. And I see tons and tons of conservative people retweeting that and tutting it. And this gives a very, very false view of what the average Presbyterian Youth Church USA congregation or average Episcopal Church congregation or average, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America congregation is like. These congregations, I watched quite a few sermons from these mainline churches over the pandemic when they were now that everybody's sermons are online. I just check them out.
Sure.
And by and large, these are not whack job, congregations. They tend to be extremely boring. I mean, that is their problem is less wackiness than that they're very boring. They're very much the kind of thing that my grandparents might have wanted to attend, more so than like the current generation wants to attend. They're very milquetoast in what they're doing. So that is much more the problem, I think, with a lot of these churches than sort of a wacky thing. So my guess is that there were probably many faithful people who were in these churches for a very long time. You had to pull them right over to the new church plant in Manhattan. And, that sort of, that again, it weakens any existing congregation. I attended a church, a church in New York during the period in which Keller retired. And, you could see a lot of ex-Redeemer people came over there. And it's great that your church is there, but when your church is made up of a lot of refugees from other congregations and it's not a lot of, new people, what's going on? So I think, I do think there's a question of, you should ask yourself, what is your purpose with this church plant? I mean, I see so many church plants. It's like they're like church in a box. You can tell there's like a formula. It's this. It's like, what is the purpose of this thing? Who is it trying to reach?
Well,
So I'm sure some of these things are very successful. But I do kind of wonder, if they're simply undermining existing congregations, and not necessarily, reaching a whole lot of new people.
right. Well, and great, because that is what is actually striking about what Keller did in Manhattan. There was not a playbook, right? There wasn't a playbook of what he was doing. Right now, there are lots of people who've taken, whether it's directly taken his book Center Church or just tried to do what they think he's doing, and tried to roll that out in every urban center in the country. But right when he did it, that wasn't it was the way he was church planning was a exception, not the rule. Whereas now that's kind of the methodology.
Right. And he did reach large number of non-Christians.
Right.
And so you look at that and say, wow, that's great. Are the average kind of church plant in an urban area doing the same thing? Now, I think a lot of people start churches in growing suburban areas because people are moving out there. You're going to serve that market. And a lot of mainline congregations were planted that way. A lot of people are moving to this suburb. We're going to create the Presbyterian church of this suburb. And, not all these older mainline congregations are super old. A lot of them date to the era of suburbanization. So, you do need to, be responsive to demographic changes, things like that. So I'm not saying that everybody, has to be a brand new convert there. But I do believe people need to be attuned to the possibility that your church plant is merely weakening existing faithful churches and is not really a net add. The other thing I've said is there's just something off about a religion that's predicated on resurrection from the dead and claims that the gospel can totally transform and revolutionize and renew your life in a radical way. Yet somehow we believe the one thing the gospel can't change is an existing church. They're hopeless. They're dead. That's the only, we're going to renew the city, or something like that. We're going to bring transformation to the city, but we can't transform our own older congregations. That's the one thing the gospel can't do, apparently. And I'm not saying that proves anything, but there's just something that just always struck me as a little bit off about that.
Well, it is interesting. I'll just share one. I could share many things I've heard throughout having started down this path. It is interesting, and it is a thing that I largely reject. But people will say church planting is really good, even primarily as an evangelism strategy, because church plants are, the established churches aren't the churches that are going to be able to do evangelism. It's church plants that will do it. And even if that's the case, which, I'm not enough to know the difference of these things. Again, it's exactly what you're saying. It would be strange to say an existing church that's filled with the Spirit, they're not going. We just can't get them to ever do evangelism in their community. And then it's then when you then plant a church, it's then this time, whatever this new plant will be, for some reason is going to be the silver bullet on that, or it'll just exist and then someone else will have to come plant again.
Right.
Thank you for joining us this week. You are going to have to tune in next week to hear the rest of our conversation with Aaron Renn. Hey, it's Restless Summer, so we're taking time in our interviews, spending time with people, talking about a lot of things. So we are splitting it into 2 weeks. It's going to be great. Also, back on Patreon, you can find me asking Aaron Renn about his thoughts on Roe v. Wade and evangelicals, if all the Republican voting paid off in light of the recent Supreme Court decision. All right, you can sign up for that for $3 a month. So get there and enjoy your restless summer. We'll catch you next week.